Part 1, The Echo of Absence. The year was 1984. The world was vibrant, full of possibility. But in a quiet Austin home, a different kind of silence had settled, one born of unspeakable grief and a void that stretched over a decade. Margaret Halbrook had known this silence intimately for 16 long years, a silence punctuated only by the annual broadcast that was both a torment and a lifeline. It was a ritual of sorrow. Every year, on this agonizing anniversary, Margaret would pay local news stations to broadcast a missing persons alert, a desperate plea echoing into the vast emptiness. As the commercial break flickered on the screen, Margaret's breath hitched. There, a family photograph, a snapshot of a life now frozen in time. Jim, her handsome husband, with his distinctive mustache and warm eyes, standing proudly beside their bright 8-year-old daughter, Lucia, her smile radiant. Beside them, an image of a gleaming red Cadillac, a symbol of happy memories, now forever tainted. The announcer's voice, a detached monotone, narrated the nightmare. 16 years ago today, Jim Halbrook and his 8-year-old daughter, Lucia, disappeared during a weekend road trip. They were last seen driving a 1979 red Cadillac DeVille, license plate THB143. If you have any information regarding their whereabouts, please contact the Austin Police Department. Margaret clicked off the television, the silence that followed heavier than any sound. Her mother, Doris, squeezed her hand, a shared burden passing between them. "I'll go upstairs to freshen up," Doris murmured, her voice thin before slowly rising. Left alone, Margaret moved through the hushed living room, her fingers tracing the spines of books on the shelf until they found it, a worn, leather-bound photo album. She returned to the sofa, opening it with the reverence one might afford a sacred text. Page after page unfolded a life that had been, moments frozen in time. Jim, beaming beside the very Cadillac that now haunted her thoughts, the car he had worked so tirelessly to afford. Lucia, on her first day of school, a tiny figure brimming with boundless energy. The three of them, laughing, their faces alight with pure joy at Barton Springs. Margaret's trembling finger traced the delicate outline of her daughter's face. "Where are you?" she whispered to the photograph, a question she had uttered countless times, each whisper a shard of her breaking heart. The shrill ring of the telephone shattered the silence, a jarring intrusion. Margaret flinched, then closed the album, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She crossed to the kitchen, her voice slightly breathless as she answered. "Hello," she managed. "Ms. Halbrook, this is Officer Daniels with the Austin Police Department." The officer's voice was calm, professional, yet it held a tremor of something profound. "We're calling because we've just received a report of potential evidence being found at a junkyard in San Marcos. We believe it could be related to your husband and daughter's case." Margaret's free hand instinctively clutched the counter, bracing herself. "What kind of evidence?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "We prefer not to discuss details over the phone, ma'am. Would you be available to come identify what's been found? We can have a patrol car pick you up in about 10 minutes. "Yes," Margaret replied instantly, her heart now hammering against her ribs. "Yes, I'll be ready." She hung up the phone, her mind reeling, and hurried to the bottom of the stairs. "Mom," she called out, her voice barely containing the surge of adrenaline. "The police just called. They found something at a junkyard in San Marcos. They think it might be connected to Jim and Lucia." Doris appeared at the top of the stairs, her face stark white. "What did they find?" she asked, her voice tight with fear. "They wouldn't say," Margaret replied, "but they're sending a car to pick us up in 10 minutes. Doris descended the stairs, her earlier weariness completely forgotten, replaced by a desperate urgency. "I'm coming with you." They waited in a tense, agonizing silence until the patrol car arrived. Officer Martinez, the officer at the wheel, offered little conversation during the hour-long drive south to San Marcos. Margaret gazed out the window, the familiar Texas landscape blurring past, her thoughts a tumultuous storm of possibilities, hopes and fears battling for dominance. Beside her, Doris clutched her purse, her knuckles white with strain. As they finally arrived at Harrov's Auto Salvage, Margaret's stomach twisted into a knot. Police vehicles and yellow crime scene tape cordoned off a section of the junkyard, a stark, unsettling sight amidst the maze of discarded metal. Officer Martinez led them through the labyrinth of junked vehicles towards a cluster of people. Margaret couldn't yet see what held their attention. "Detective Reyes," Officer Martinez called out as they approached. "Mrs. Halbrook and her mother are here." A tall man in plain clothes turned, his expression carefully neutral, betraying nothing. "Mrs. Halbrook, Mrs. Barrett, I'm Detective Reyes. Thank you for coming so quickly." What did you find? Margaret asked, her voice surprisingly steady despite the violent tremor in her hands. Detective Reyes stepped aside, and Margaret's legs nearly gave out beneath her. There, amidst the twisted metal, crushed almost beyond recognition, but still undeniably, unmistakably there, was a red Cadillac DeVille. The once gleaming paint was now dull and rusted, but in Margaret's mind, there was no doubt. This was Jim's car, the car he had saved for years to buy, the car he had lovingly maintained, the car he and Lucia had driven away in 16 years ago. "Oh my God," Doris whispered beside her, gripping Margaret's arm for support, her voice thick with shock. Margaret approached the vehicle slowly, as if in a trance. The car had been partially crushed, presumably by the massive excavator nearby. Police officers meticulously photographed every angle while others measured and searched the surrounding area. "We can't check the interior because of the condition," Detective Reyes explained gently. "But we need to confirm. Is this your husband's car, Mrs. Halbrook?" Margaret circled the crumpled vehicle, her eyes scanning every detail, a desperate search for any familiar mark. Finally, she stopped at what remained of the right rear wheel. She pointed to a small dent in the chrome wheel cover. "Jim hit a curb the week before they disappeared," she said, her voice distant, as if from a dream. "We were going to get it fixed, but—" Her voice trailed off, lost in the overwhelming wave of grief and memory. She looked up at Detective Reyes, her eyes brimming with tears she fiercely refused to shed. "Yes," she whispered, her voice cracking. "This is their car." Detective Reyes nodded solemnly, then gestured to a man standing nervously at the edge of the crime scene. "This is Dean Lamb, the owner of the junkyard. He's the one who called us." Dean stepped forward, wiping his hands on a rag before offering one to Margaret. "I'm so sorry, ma'am. I had no idea about the car's history. I swear it was scheduled to be crushed this morning, and I was in my office afterward when I saw the missing persons segment on TV. I recognized the car immediately and called the police." "How did it get here?" Margaret demanded, ignoring his outstretched hand. "Who brought it in?" Dean shifted uncomfortably. "That's just it, ma'am. I don't have any record of it being brought in. It's not in our system at all." "That sounds suspicious," Doris said sharply, her gaze fixed on Dean. Detective Reyes held up a hand. "Mr. Lamb was the one who alerted us to the car's presence, Ms. Barrett. We have no reason to believe he was involved in its appearance here." "I've been trying to figure out how it got here myself," Dean insisted, his voice earnest. "We have strict protocols for accepting vehicles, paperwork, IDs, the works." As he spoke, a woman in greasy overalls approached the group. "I saw Reed bring it in," she stated plainly. All eyes turned to her. "Reed?" Detective Reyes asked. "Reed Curraway?" Dean explained, "He's my partner, runs the technical side of things. He's the head technician here." Detective Reyes immediately pulled out his phone. "We need to speak with him. Can you call him?" Dean nodded, pulled out his own phone, and dialed. After a few moments, he shook his head. No answer. "I'll need his home address," Detective Reyes said firmly. "Of course," Dean replied, pulling a small notebook from his pocket and scribbling down an address. "He lives in South Austin. Here's his information." Detective Reyes took the paper and turned to one of his officers. "I want a unit sent to this address immediately. Have them bring Mr. Carraway in for questioning." He turned back to Dean. "Is there anything else of Mr. Carraway's on the premises that might be relevant to our investigation?" "His office," Dean said, "but it's locked and only Reed has the key." "We'll need a warrant to search it properly," Detective Reyes said, turning to another officer. "Get that in motion." Margaret stood silently through this exchange, her eyes never leaving the crushed Cadillac. 16 years of wondering, of hoping against hope. And now this. The car that had carried her husband and daughter away from her for the last time was here, crushed beyond recognition. But there was no sign of Jim or Lucia. "Let's search the area," Detective Reyes instructed his team. "Mrs. Halbrook, Ms. Barrett, if you feel up to it, your help in identifying any potential personal items would be invaluable." Margaret nodded mutely, and she and Doris followed the officers as they began a methodical search of the junkyard. Hours passed as they painstakingly examined piles of scrap metal and discarded items, but nothing related to Jim or Lucia surfaced. Eventually, they found themselves outside Reed Carraway's locked office, waiting for either the man himself or the warrant that would allow them to search it. Margaret leaned against the wall, exhaustion etched into every line of her face. Doris stood beside her, one arm wrapped around her daughter's shoulders, both women silent and lost in thought as the afternoon sun climbed higher in the sky. At Part 2, the hidden compartment. The hours stretched into an eternity. Margaret and Doris waited, the silence of the junkyard punctuated only by the distant hum of traffic and the occasional creak of shifting metal. Their nerves frayed, Margaret paced restlessly, her gaze continually drawn back to the crumpled red Cadillac. It was a tomb, a cruel reminder of 16 years of unanswered prayers. Detective Reyes was on his phone, speaking in hushed tones, his brow furrowed. Finally, he hung up and turned to them. We have good news and, well, no news on Mr. Carraway yet. The good news is the warrant for his office came through. We can go in now. A flicker of hope ignited in Margaret's chest. Perhaps finally they would find something, anything. Detective Reyes led them back to Reed Carraway's office, a small, grimy shack nestled at the back of the junkyard. The door was forced open, revealing a cramped, chaotic space. Papers were scattered across a dusty desk, tools lay haphazardly on the floor, and the air was thick with the smell of stale cigarettes and oil. It was hardly the neat, organized space one might expect of a head technician. All right, team, Detective Reyes instructed. Every inch of this office, look for anything that connects Mr. Carraway to the Halbrook disappearance or anything related to the Cadillac. Officers fanned out, meticulously sifting through the mess. Margaret and Doris stood by, watching with bated breath, their hearts pounding with a mixture of dread and anticipation. Every rustle of paper, every clink of metal felt like a momentous event. Minutes stretched into what felt like an hour. Then an officer from behind the desk let out a gasp. "Detective, over here!" Everyone rushed to his side. The officer pointed to a loose floorboard beneath the desk. "Look," he said, his voice hushed with excitement. "It's not nailed down properly." Detective Reyes knelt and, with a grunt, pried up the board. Beneath it, hidden in the dusty cavity, was a small, worn blue handbag. Margaret gasped. Her hand flew to her mouth, stifling a cry. She knew that handbag. She had sewn the beads onto it herself, a mother's loving touch. It was Lucia's. "Lucia's," Margaret whispered, her voice choked with emotion. She reached for it, but Detective Reyes gently stopped her. "We can't touch it directly, Mrs. Halbrook. It's evidence. But can you confirm, is this your daughter's handbag?" Tears streamed down Margaret's face, unchecked now. "Yes," she sobbed. "Yes, it's hers. I made it for her." Doris wrapped an arm around her, tears also welling in her eyes. Carefully, using gloved hands, an evidence technician lifted the handbag. It was surprisingly heavy. He opened it slowly, revealing the contents. Inside, nestled among a few crumpled tissues and a child's hair clip, was a small, bound diary. It was faded, its pages yellowed with age, but unmistakable. Lucia's diary. "Oh, Lucia," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible. The sight of her daughter's belongings after 16 years was an overwhelming torrent of grief and a fragile tendril of hope. Could this diary hold the answers she had so desperately sought? The technician also pulled out a small, old-fashioned audio cassette recorder, the kind popular in the 1980s, and a single cassette tape. "A cassette recorder?" Detective Reyes murmured, intrigued. "And a tape." He looked at Margaret. "Do you recognize this, Mrs. Halbrook?" Margaret shook her head. "No, Lucia didn't have one of those." "Interesting," Detective Reyes mused. He directed the technician to carefully log and package all the items. "These will need to go to the lab immediately, the diary especially, but it could contain vital information." As the items were secured, Detective Reyes turned back to Dean Lamb, who had been watching the discovery with wide, bewildered eyes. "You said Carraway was your partner. Did he ever mention anything unusual? Any strange behavior?" Dean shook his head slowly. "Not really. Reed's always been a bit of a loner, kept to himself. He was good with cars, technically brilliant, but not much for conversation. I never thought anything of it." "And you never saw him bring in this Cadillac?" "Never. And it definitely wasn't in our system. That's what's so weird about this whole thing." Dean looked genuinely perplexed and a little frightened. "I mean, how could he have gotten it in without me knowing?" Detective Reyes' phone buzzed. He answered, his expression hardening as he listened. "They found him," he announced grimly, hanging up. "He was at his home, but he resisted arrest. They're bringing him in now. He's being taken to the precinct for questioning." A cold wave washed over Margaret. Reed Carraway. The man who somehow brought her husband's car to this junkyard. The man who might hold the key to 16 years of torment. She looked at the blue handbag, then at the spot where the car had been found. The pieces were starting to connect, but the full picture remained agonizingly out of reach. What horrors had that car witnessed? And what secrets did Lucia's diary hold? The answers were tantalizingly close, yet still shrouded in a dark, terrifying mystery. And Part 3, Interrogation Room Secrets. The sterile fluorescent lights of the Austin Police Department interrogation room hummed overhead, casting a harsh glare on Reed Carraway. He sat hunched in a metal chair, his eyes darting nervously around the small, windowless space. He was a gaunt man with thinning hair and a perpetually anxious expression. Detective Reyes sat opposite him, his demeanor calm but his gaze unwavering. "Mr. Carraway," Detective Reyes began, his voice even, "we found a 1979 red Cadillac DeVille at your junkyard in San Marcos. The license plate matched a vehicle that disappeared 16 years ago with James and Lucia Halbrook." Reed's eyes widened slightly, but he remained silent. We also found a child's blue handbag hidden in your office, a handbag positively identified as belonging to Lucia Halbrook. Care to explain that, Mr. Carraway? Reed swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. I don't know anything about that. His voice was raspy, barely above a whisper. You expect us to believe that a handbag belonging to a missing child, a child who vanished with the same car found on your property, just happened to be hidden in your personal office, and you have no idea how it got there? Detective Reyes leaned forward, his gaze intensifying. Yes, Reed insisted, his voice gaining a sliver of strength. I've never seen that bag before in my life. Someone must have planted it there. Who would plant it there, Mr. Carraway, and why? Reed wrung his hands, his eyes still flitting around the room. I don't know. Maybe Dean, he's been acting strange lately. Dean Lamb, your partner, the man who called us about the car? Detective Reyes raised an eyebrow. What motive would he have to plant evidence against you? I don't know, Reed exclaimed, his voice rising in panic. Maybe he wants to take over the business. We've had some disagreements. Detective Reyes remained impassive. We also found an audio cassette recorder and a tape in your office, along with the handbag. Do you recognize these? Reed shook his head vehemently. No, never seen them. Detective Reyes slid a photograph across the table. It was a picture of the crushed red Cadillac. Mr. Carraway, did you bring this car to the junkyard? Reed hesitated for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the photograph. Finally, he nodded slowly. Yes, I did. When? About 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago? 16 years after it disappeared? Where did you find it? Reed's story began to unravel. He claimed he found the car abandoned in a storage unit he had recently purchased at auction. He said he didn't think anything of it at the time, just saw it as scrap metal. He couldn't explain why he hadn't logged it into the junkyard's system. He also couldn't explain the presence of Lucia's handbag and the recording equipment in his locked office. Detective Reyes pressed him on every detail, pointing out the inconsistencies in his story. Why hide the handbag? Why not report finding such an old car? Why lie about not knowing the recorder? The interrogation continued for hours, a relentless dance of questions and evasions. Reed remained steadfast in his denials regarding any knowledge of the Halbrooks' disappearance. He insisted he simply found the car and had no idea of its history or the significance of the items found in his office. Meanwhile, back at the junkyard, the forensic team meticulously examined the crushed Cadillac. They managed to extract some debris from the interior, including fabric samples and hair strands, all of which were sent to the lab for analysis. The discovery of Lucia's handbag had shifted the investigation into high gear. The hope, however faint, that Jim and Lucia might still be alive dwindled with each passing hour. The focus now was on understanding how their car ended up in that junkyard after all these years, and what Reed Carraway truly knew. The secrets hidden within Lucia's diary and the contents of that cassette tape could be the key to finally unlocking the truth behind their vanishing. Part 4, The Diary's Whispers. Days turned into a week. The forensic lab worked tirelessly, analyzing the evidence recovered from the junkyard and Reed Carraway's office. The fabric samples from the Cadillac matched the upholstery of a 1979 DeVille. The hair strands were consistent with those of a young Caucasian female, pending further DNA analysis. The cassette tape was carefully processed, revealing a single recorded track. But it was Lucia's diary that held the most immediate promise. Its small, yellowed pages contained the innocent scribbles and drawings of an 8-year-old girl. Tales of school, friends, and family outings filled the initial entries, painting a picture of a happy, normal childhood. As Detective Reyes and his team meticulously translated and reviewed the diary, they reached the entries leading up to the fateful road trip. The entries became more fragmented, tinged with a subtle unease. Lucia wrote about an argument between her parents, hushed voices behind closed doors. She mentioned her dad seemed sad and that her mom had been crying. The days leading up to the trip were described as strange and quiet. The last entry, dated the day they disappeared, was brief and chilling. Daddy said we're going on a special adventure. Mommy looked best when we left. I hope she's okay. I packed Sparky, her stuffed dog, and my blue bag. There was no mention of their destination or any other details about the trip. The diary offered a poignant glimpse into Lucia's final days, but provided no direct answers about their disappearance or how the car ended up in the junkyard. However, the mention of her blue bag confirmed the recovered handbag was indeed hers, strengthening the link to Reed Carraway. The audio cassette tape, once cleaned and digitized, revealed a short, amateur recording. It sounded like a conversation, muffled and indistinct at times, but two voices could be clearly discerned, a man and a woman. The man's voice was rough, and the woman's was filled with fear and desperation. Just tell me where she is, Jim, the woman's voice pleaded, her tone frantic. I told you, Carol, she's safe. You're not going to take her away from me. The man, presumably Jim Halbrook, replied, his voice strained and angry. She needs her mother. What are you doing? Carol cried out, her voice laced with panic. The recording ended abruptly with a loud thud and then silence. Detective Reyes played the recording for Margaret. The moment Carol's voice filled the room, Margaret's breath hitched. She recognized it instantly, but it was her own voice, younger and filled with a terror she would never forget. The man's voice, though distorted by time and the recording quality, bore a chilling resemblance to Jim's. Margaret's mind reeled. An argument. Carol. That was her maiden name. The recording suggested a custody dispute, a desperate act. But what had happened after that thud? And how did Reed Caraway come into possession of this tape? Detective Reyes now had a potential motive for Jim's disappearance, a bitter custody battle. But it didn't explain Lucia's diary in Reed's office or the Cadillac in his junkyard. The forensic report on Reed Caraway's fingerprints came back. His prints were found inside the Cadillac, but only in the front driver's area. His prints were also found on the blue handbag, the cassette recorder, and the cassette tape. This placed him in direct contact with Lucia's belongings and the potentially crucial recording. Detective Reyes brought Reed back in for another round of questioning, this time armed with the new evidence. Hacker Part 5, The Unraveling. Confronted with the fingerprint evidence and the content of the audio recording, Reed Caraway's carefully constructed denials began to crumble. He still maintained he had no direct knowledge of Jim and Lucia's disappearance, but his story about finding the car in a storage unit started to shift. He admitted that he had known Jim Halbrook, though only casually, through a mutual acquaintance years ago. He vaguely recalled hearing about Jim's marital problems and a custody dispute. He still couldn't explain how Lucia's handbag and the recording ended up in his office, suggesting someone might have planted them to frame him. Detective Reyes pressed him relentlessly. Mr. Caraway, your fingerprints are all over Lucia Halbrook's belongings and a recording that suggests a violent confrontation. You found their car 16 years later and didn't report it. You hid a child's handbag in your office. These are not the actions of an innocent bystander. Finally, under the weight of the mounting evidence and the relentless questioning, a crack appeared in Reed's facade. He confessed to finding the Cadillac abandoned not in a storage unit, but in a secluded wooded area outside of Austin approximately 15 years prior. He claimed he had stumbled upon it by chance while hiking. He looked inside, found it empty, and for reasons he couldn't fully articulate, decided to take it to his junkyard and keep it hidden. When asked about Lucia's handbag and the tape, Reed finally offered a chilling, albeit still incomplete, explanation. He claimed that a few years after finding the car, he had gone back to the location where he discovered it, out of morbid curiosity. That's when he said he found the blue handbag and the cassette recorder nearby, partially buried in the undergrowth. He took them, again not knowing what to do, and eventually stored them in his office. He vehemently denied ever meeting Lucia or having any involvement in the Halbrooks' disappearance. He insisted he was just a man who stumbled upon a tragic secret and made a series of bad decisions out of fear and confusion. While Reed's confession explained the presence of the Cadillac and Lucia's belongings at the junkyard, it didn't explain what happened to Jim and Lucia. Where were their bodies? Had Reed stumbled upon a crime scene? Or was he more involved than he was letting on? The police launched a massive search of the wooded area Reed described, hoping to find any further evidence, any trace of Jim and Lucia. Days of searching yielded nothing. The trail had gone cold 16 years ago, and Reed's belated and incomplete confession offered little in the way of closure. The case of Jim and Lucia Halbrook remained officially unsolved. Reed Caraway was charged with obstruction of justice and tampering with evidence. Margaret was left with the devastating confirmation that the red Cadillac, a symbol of happier times, had been lying in a junkyard for years, while the fate of her husband and daughter remained a haunting unknown. The whispers from Lucia's diary and the chilling voices on the cassette tape offered fragments of a tragedy. But the full, heartbreaking story of what happened on that fateful road trip in 1984 remained lost to time. A stark and enduring testament to the enduring pain of a family torn apart by a mystery that may never be fully solved.